Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tudor History in 10 with our very special guest today, Gareth Russell, who is going to introduce himself in just a moment. But I just wanted to let you know what we're going to be talking about today. It's quite a controversial issue and a sensitive one, and that's whether Catherine Howard was ever a victim of child abuse, or are we just seeing this through a distorted 21st century lens? Well, Gareth's going to unpack that for us in 10 minutes. Wow, Gareth, you've got a job ahead of you here.
Fingers crossed.
Anyway, for those folk who don't know you, do you want to just give us a few words of introduction?
Sure. So I had a little bit of mic problems, which is why I've turned up looking like one of the Bletchley Park girls with this. It's not my usual attire, although maybe it should be. Yeah, so my name is Gareth Russell. I've written several books, but the one that's relevant to today is Young and Damned and Fair, which is a biography of Queen Catherine Howard. I also completed my postgraduate thesis on Catherine's household.
And I have to say, it's a really great book. I
Oh,
don't
thank
get a
you.
lot of chance to read books these days, but when I picked it up, I read it from cover to cover. So
Oh,
that is
thank you very much.
huge accolade. Okay, let's get straight on in there. Can you give us the basic facts
Mhm.
as relates to Catherine, and particularly why we think that she might have been the victim of some kind of
Sure.
sort of sexual child abuse?
So I think part of it starts with dates, and that's so important. I think the child abuse theory, which by the way I should say just from the get-go, is a theory I strongly disagree with, and I explain a bit more in the book, and I'll try to explain here why. But the child abuse theory is not based on, I think, subpar scholarship. I don't think it's the result of sort of historical fecklessness by those who do believe it. A large part of it boils down to dates, and it is difficult. These alleged relationships happened in quite a narrow time frame in Catherine's life, and obviously because her life was so tragically short, the difference of a year or two makes a huge difference in terms of the possibility of what we would now call grooming and abuse. So for a very long time, the standard narrative was that Catherine entered into a relationship, whether you think it was consensual or not, with her music teacher, a man called Henry Mannix, sometime around 1536. Now, the year 1536 does just seem to have been one of those magical pieces of historical detritus that float around in Tudor history, that when we look at it, we can't really see why on earth it got picked as the year that this started. There's really no evidence. There's nothing I could find in the research that disproved that Mannix, young Mannix, as he's referred to a couple of times, or Mannock in one of the sources, but let's say Mannix, there's nothing to disprove that he was there in 1536, but actually the point at which the earliest reference that we can find would suggest that this relationship between her and her music teacher was probably getting off the ground in early 1538. Well, there's also a debate over Catherine's date of birth, as you know.
Mhm.
We're not really sure. In the 1990s, it was very popular to say she was born in 1525. That is more or less now recognized, not universally, but from a documentary point of view, that borders on the impossible. The most likely date of birth was 1522 or maybe 1523. So we're looking at a relationship that's beginning when she is about 15 or 16. The relationship does not last long. We actually know from the testament of another person in the household who knew both of them. She actually knew Mannix slightly better, but she did know Catherine, a woman called Mary Lascelles. She is very clear, as in fact, in fairness to Mary, is everyone involved, that the relationship was not consummated. Catherine, he says some very, very sexually graphic things about wanting to take her maidenhead, which she had said that she had said she would, and she didn't really seem to want to. So I think we can actually assume that there is an element of pressure and manipulation from Mannix here. That Catherine ultimately evades. She ends the relationship, and she then begins a relationship with a man who's more her social equal, called Francis Derham. He comes from a very wealthy family of the Lincolnshire gentry. He's been sent as a ward to live with the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, who's Catherine's legal guardian and step grandmother. There's talk of that relationship ending in marriage. Francis really pushes this, and one of the things. So just to give the reason some people have, I think, taken literally when she says later that this was beyond her desert or desire. They have taken that to imply sexual coercion and force. Actually, she was, if you look at it in the broader paragraph of what she's saying, she's trying to say, I didn't agree to marry him.
Mm.
I didn't, she's trying to get out of this idea that she was legally bound to him. Understandably, he was a horror show of a human,
Yeah.
but so what we see is a narrative that sort of puts A to B and comes up with E slightly, but it's not an unreasonable conclusion that there was a sexually exploitative relationship when she was young, probably not as young, mercifully,
Mm. Mm.
as we once thought, and that this then led to a relationship of sexual violence. The relationships are, and you asked a question, are we looking at this
Mm.
through a modern lens? I don't agree with the theory, but I do sort of have to defend the theorists, because I think they get a very hard and unfair rap from some people who don't believe Catherine was the victim of abuse or coercion. It is unfair to engage with a theory by saying you just don't understand Tudor history and going after that and saying that any form of sexual depravity or coercion in the 1500s was totally
Mm.
acceptable, and that you're being a sort of a bleeding heart 21st
Mm.
centuryite. If you question that, that is not the case. I don't agree with the conclusions they've reached. They're not unreasonable
Mm.
conclusions.
Mm.
There was a concept of coercion and the abuse of children. It's actually it's slightly more specific in its vocabulary when it comes to the abuse of female children than male. There's some work being done at the minute, sort of on cases against child abuse being prosecuted during the Elizabethan period. But generally speaking, this language did exist. It's not an idea that no one thought child abuse existed in the 16th century. So I don't think it's a case of looking at it through a false prism. I just don't agree that the evidence is there that really supports it. But I feel I have to defend the people making the argument, because they're making it in, I think, a broadly sensitive and appropriate and important way. I haven't come across any historian who's put this
Mm.
forward that I've thought is being sensationalist. I just happen not to agree with them.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it's an incredibly complex topic to squeeze into
Sure,
such a small space of
sure.
time, but you've raised a few points for people to think about,
Yeah,
and we're going to talk about where people can find out more information.
sure.
But if we're not thinking of Catherine in that way, we often think of her as this ditzy girl,
Mhm.
who just was too giddy. In the like minute that we really
Yeah.
have before we start wrapping up, how would you say we should remember Catherine? What is her kind of legacy?
Well, firstly, this is the first time I've announced this, so I'm really happy to do that. I'm going to be setting up a website to share some research papers I've been doing. And I'm going to be arguing that I do think Frances Derham shows a lot of signs of narcissism and narcissistic love bombing in the relationship. And I think it's just a discussion I'd like to start, because I think we can have these discussions. And it's been fascinating and really, really chilling to see, we have to get away from this idea in history that relationships are either consensual and healthy or non-consensual and unhealthy. All non-consensual relationships are unhealthy. Not all consensual relationships are healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And Catherine's early relationships can fall into the brackets of consensual, and particularly in the Derham case, increasingly deeply unhealthy. So you can obviously read a bit more about the perspective I put across in Young and Damned and Fair. There are other biographies, Connor Burns, Josephine Wilkinson's, that put forward a little bit more of the contrary argument, as does Retha Warnick's entry in the ODMB.
Ah, I see. Great. When's this website going to be live for us, and
I
how can
can't.
we check it?
I'm finishing editing a book on the Queen Mother at the minute, in the middle of April, so I'm hoping early May.
Oh,
Um,
brilliant, brilliant. That's
yeah,
absolutely
yeah.
fantastic. So we'll
So,
have to follow you. Where can we follow you to get all the latest info on
So
what's happening?
I'm on Instagram and underscore Gareth Russell. I'm on Facebook as Gareth Russell Historian, and I'm very, very infrequently on Twitter. So stick to Instagram and Facebook if you're so
Instagram
inclined.
is the place. Well, this
Yeah.
sounds very interesting. And I can't wait to talk to you again, because we're going to be picking up on another controversial topic later on the year, which is Anne Boleyn's date of birth, which you do
Yes. Yeah.
have
Yeah.
written a brilliant blog about. I can only What's the name of your blog, just so people can?
Oh, I don't really use it anymore. I
You
sort of
don't use it?
I do. I hate the name as well. I agree. Anyway,
Oh,
but it was. I started about 15 years ago. But I might repost the article. I argue for a later date of birth. Yeah.
it's good.
So.
Anyway, we're about to run out of time.
Oh,
People know
thank
where to
you.
follow you. Yay! Thank you
Great.
so
Thanks
much.
so much.